Horrifying. The time was 2 a.m. The Coral Sea, off the coast of far north Queensland, was so quiet it seemed to be fast asleep. Only the sound of small waves lapping against the hull of the Royal Australian Navy patrol boat, HMAS Armidale, could be heard, a slow, repeating rhythm like a long, steady breath. The sky was still pitch black. A half-moon was covered by thin clouds. On the ship's deck, sailors stood watch, their eyes alert. They were used to the lonely nights at sea. But this night was different. Something felt strange. The ship's radar, which usually only showed the dots of local fishermen, suddenly flickered and highlighted a strange green marker. The dot was moving slowly, not straight towards the coast, nor out to the open sea, just circling aimlessly. As if it were a soulless ship, drifting like a ghostly shadow in the darkness. The ship's commander, Lieutenant Commander Alex Price, frowned. He knew his instincts were never wrong. Something wasn't right. With a firm voice, he commanded the crew. Approach the target. Signal lights on. Prepare the loudspeaker. The order was met with the swift movements of the sailors. The searchlight was switched on, signaling the foreign vessel to stop. From the loudspeaker came the official call, demanding identification and sailing permits. But instead of stopping, the 15-meter boat just lurched for a moment. Then it tried to flee. The engine roared loudly. Waves splashed. But only for a moment. Suddenly, the engine sound cut out. Darkness took over again. The patrol boat immediately moved closer. The beam of the searchlight pierced the gloom, and 3 figures were clearly visible on the deck. Their bodies were shaking. Their faces were deathly pale, like people who had just seen death. Commander Price raised his voice. "Who are you? Where is this vessel from?" The answer came in a stammering voice. "I'm the skipper, Rick Santen, 48, from Sydney. 2 crewmen named Bruce Buddy Palmer from Melbourne and Andy Shaw from Darwin." The sailing permit papers they showed looked odd. The numbers and writing had been rubbed out, as if deliberately altered. The air on the ship's deck felt increasingly tense. Several sailors glanced at each other. They all had a bad feeling. Commander Price didn't want to waste time. "Check the freezer hold." Everyone turned towards the tightly shut steel door. 2 sailors moved forward to open the heavy lock. As the steel door slid open, a harsh grating sound was heard. It was followed by a blast of cold air mixed with a pungent smell. It wasn't the usual smell of fresh fish, but a strange aroma that made your chest feel tight. The smell was like a mixture of rotten ice and something far more horrifying. Several sailors instinctively covered their noses. They grimaced. A torch beam was aimed inside. A pile of rigid, frozen ice blocks was visible. Tucked neatly between the ice were large, black plastic bags. Too large to be mere bags of seafood. Like mysterious blocks, cold and silent. A brave sailor stepped closer. With a folding knife, he tore the edge of one of the bags. In a matter of seconds, the silent atmosphere turned into indescribable horror. From behind the black plastic, a human hand stuck out. Pale, stiff, and frozen. Everyone froze. Hearts pounded. It was as if the world had stopped spinning. Another bag was opened. Then the next. And the reality that was uncovered made everyone's chest feel crushed. Not fish, not seafood, but the bodies of young women, lifeless, forced into curling positions, stacked like merchandise. A total of 17 bodies were found. Their skin was blue, their faces lifeless, their eyes closed in a cold eternity. The sailors, accustomed to facing threats at sea, could only bow their heads this time, their jaws clenched. Some clenched their fists, Others stood silent with tears welling in their eyes. On the deck, the air felt heavy, as if every breath carried sorrow. Lieutenant Commander Price stood rigid. His eyes were sharp as he looked at the skipper and his crew. His voice was heavy with suppressed emotion. "This isn't a fishing boat anymore. It's a ship full of spirits. Lock down the entire area immediately. No one in or out. Report to command, now." The radio crackled. An emergency report was sent to AFB National Headquarters, which was immediately forwarded to the AFB and Queensland Police. In a matter of minutes, a special operation was declared. That night, in the middle of the calm Coral Sea, a dark history had just been uncovered. A nightmare that would never fade from the memories of those who witnessed it. Meanwhile, in a coastal town not far from the harbour, an old fisherman named Mick Yarra was mending a net on the veranda of his high-set Queenslander. From a distance, he saw the patrol boat's searchlight cutting through the dark sky. He wondered. Usually, the patrol boat just passed by silently. Tonight was different. He didn't know that what he was seeing from the shore would be the beginning of a major story that would later be talked about by the whole country. For the sailors, the night was usually just about waves, stars, and wind. But that night, they were confronted with the bitterest reality, that behind the darkness of the sea, there are humans who treat their fellow humans more cruelly than animals. And from that moment on, this case was no longer just a vessel inspection. It turned into the beginning of a major investigation that would later be known by the code name, Operation 924N. An operation that would uncover the true face of the most vicious human trafficking in Australian waters. The early morning sea breeze cut through the skin. Cold, but still carrying the distinct salty aroma of the far north Queensland waters. The Rand patrol boat was now fully secured alongside the mysterious vessel that had tried to escape. Large searchlights illuminated every corner, making it impossible for the three men on the boat's deck to hide any longer. They stood frozen, bodies trembling. Their faces were so pale they looked drained of blood. Lieutenant Commander Alex Price stepped forward. His voice echoed loudly between the sounds of the waves. "Hands where I can see them. Don't move." The patrol crew quickly raised their service weapons, ready for any resistance. But the three men didn't resist, just stood stiffly, looking at each other with eyes full of fear. One of them, slightly overweight with greying hair, dared to speak. "My name's Rick Santen. I'm the skipper of this boat. From Sydney." His voice was hoarse as if choked with anxiety. Next to him, a man with olive skin introduced himself haltingly. "I'm Bruce Palmer, from Melbourne." While the youngest, with a thin face, looked nervous and just identified himself as Andy Shaw. "From Darwin." Lieutenant Commander Price held out his hand, demanding the ship's documents. Rick quickly pulled out a worn plastic folder containing the sailing permit. Price opened it, examining it carefully. His brow furrowed immediately. The ink in several sections looked blurred, as if it had been rubbed out and overwritten. The ship's registration number also looked fake. Other sailors inspected the hull. The identification number that was usually clearly displayed was blurred, as if deliberately erased. All these signs made the suspicion grow stronger. Lieutenant Commander Price stared hard at Rick. "Do you think we can't tell the difference between real and fake documents? What exactly is this ship's cargo?" Rick stammered, his eyes searching for an excuse. "Just frozen fish, boss. We're small-time fishermen, just carrying a catch for someone else. Nothing strange." His words sounded repetitive, unconvincing. Bruce nodded quickly, as if to reinforce the skipper's statement. Meanwhile, Andy, the youngest, just looked down. His face was pale, his lips trembling. On the patrol boat's deck, the tension grew. The sailors looked at each other. Their instincts told them something much bigger was hidden. Commander Price decided not to believe a single word from their mouths. He knew very well that guilty people usually try to cover it up with short, hurried answers. In a firm tone, he gave the order, "Get the inspection team ready. We are checking the contents of the freezer hold. Right now." The three men in front of him instantly panicked. Rick took a half step forward, trying to stop them. "No need, sir. It's just fish for the market. If you open it, the ice will melt, the goods will be ruined." That statement only added to the suspicion. Lieutenant Commander Price stared into his eyes without blinking, then gestured with his hand. Two sailors immediately pushed towards the steel hold door, while the rest kept a close watch on the three men, who now looked even more shaky. Those seconds felt so long. The sound of the steel lock turning. The creak of the door echoed loudly in the night silence. Everyone on deck held their breath. Rick covered his face with his hands. Bruce took a step back. Andy almost collapsed as his knees went weak. When the steel door began to open, cold air rushed out, making the hairs on their necks stand on end. The strange smell immediately hit them, stinging their noses. Not the aroma of fresh fish as they claimed. Several sailors instinctively took a half step back, covering their noses with their sleeves. In the silence, everyone's heart felt like it was screaming. What were they really carrying on this boat? Why were the three men's faces so terrified? Lieutenant Commander Price straightened up, fighting the uneasy feeling in his chest. He knew they were about to witness something they had never imagined. And sure enough, as the torch beams were aimed inside the hold, the horrifying truth began to unfold. The night, which had only felt strange before, now turned into a nightmare. The boat, initially suspected of being just an illegal fishing vessel, turned out to be hiding the darkest secret behind layers of solid ice. The sailors looked at each other. They knew from that second on, this case was no longer a small matter. This was the doorway to a massive tragedy that would shake the hearts of many. The heavy steel door was now wide open. The cold air, mixed with the strange smell, billowed out, thicker now, stinging all the way to the throat. The sailors looked at each other. Their eyes were filled with doubt and a fear of the truth that was about to be revealed. Lieutenant Commander Price gave a nod. Torches were aimed into the hold, penetrating the layers of ice stacked neatly like small mountains. Behind the ice pile, several large black plastic bags were visible. They were layered, arranged so neatly, as if it wasn't just an ordinary fisherman's cargo. A young sailor, able seaman Yudkin, stepped forward, his face tense. He drew a folding knife from his belt. His hand trembled slightly. Carefully, he stuck the tip of the knife into one of the bags and made a small tear. The next second, the entire deck was plunged into a deafening silence. From the tear, a human hand poked out. Stiff, pale, and bluish. The fingers were frozen, lifeless. Able seaman Yudkin staggered backward. His face was ashen. The whole ship was silent. Only the small sound of the waves could still be heard faintly, as if the ocean itself was grieving. Several other sailors covered their mouths, fighting the nausea rising in their throats. Lieutenant Commander Price stepped forward, staring intently at the body part. His voice was low but firm. "Open all of them." His command was like thunder splitting the night. The second bag was opened. Then the third. The bodies of young women began to appear, frozen in curled positions, as if forced into a cramped space. Their faces were pale with blue lips. Their eyes were closed in eternal silence. The atmosphere on deck turned into a sea of sorrow. The sailors, accustomed to facing storms, smugglers, and even pirates, were silent this time, unable to speak. Some looked down, some clenched their fists so tightly their knuckles turned white. One by one, the bags were pulled from the hold. The number grew. The count stopped at 17. 17 bodies of young women, all frozen. Stacked like lifeless merchandise. They should still be alive, laughing, and dreaming. But now, only cold, silent corpses remained. Andy Shaw, the youngest crew member, collapsed onto the deck floor. His hands covered his face, his shoulders shaking. Bruce Palmer trembled while muttering softly. It was unclear what he was saying. Rick Santen stood stiffly, his face pale, his eyes staring blankly into the distance, as if all his strength was gone. Lieutenant Commander Price took a long, deep breath, his chest tight. In his heart, he said, "Tonight, a dark history is being written on our nation's seas." He looked at his sailors lined up along the side of the boat, then said in a voice that trembled but remained dignified, "Don't anyone forget these faces. They are not numbers. They are people." A senior sailor, leading Seaman Harrison, stared at the bodies with wet eyes. He remembered his own daughter at home, who was the same age as the victims. His heart broke imagining if one of those bodies was his own child. Meanwhile, in the distance, the lights of Cairns Harbour flickered faintly. The world on land was probably still asleep. Unaware that out in the middle of the sea, 17 lives had been found, frozen. Other sailors began documenting, taking photos, writing notes, and setting up a security perimeter. All procedures were followed, but their hearts were still heavy. The cold smell mixed with death continued to sting, making the night feel longer than usual. Lieutenant Commander Price gave another order. "Secure this entire vessel. Don't let anyone near it. Contact command, request full support. Tonight, we are dealing with a crime far greater than mere smuggling." The radio crackled to life. The emergency report was relayed to Queensland Police Command. The atmosphere on deck grew quieter. Only the sound of muffled sobs could be heard from several sailors trying to stay strong. In everyone's mind, big questions arose. Who were they? Where did they come from? And who could be so cruel as to treat human beings like cold merchandise to be thrown away? That night, the Coral Sea held a dark secret that was finally exposed. A seemingly ordinary fishing boat turned out to be a death ship, carrying the spirits of 17 young women whose lives had been cruelly snatched away. The sailors knew from that moment on, their duty was not just to guard the sea, but also to uphold justice for the lives that had been taken. The tension on the ship's deck was thick. The searchlight still illuminated the opened black bags, revealing the frozen bodies of the young women. A long silence hung over them. Only the continuous sound of the sea, as if nature itself was mourning. Lieutenant Commander Price stood tall. But his face clearly showed the turmoil he was feeling. His eyes scanned his sailors one by one. He knew that even though they were tough men, accustomed to facing threats and dangers at sea, tonight they were forced to witness something far more horrifying than weapons or massive waves. They were facing a crime that stripped away human dignity. With a heavy voice, he broke the silence. "Lock down all access to this vessel immediately. No one gets in or out without authorization." The instruction was carried out instantly. Sailors moved quickly, setting up security lines, checking every corner of the boat, and ensuring the 3 crew members remained under guard, handcuffed. Rick Santen, the skipper, just sat limply on the deck floor. Bruce Palmer kept his head down without a sound. Andy Shaw was still shaking, occasionally covering his face with his hands. Not one of them could say a word. Everything was already too clear. The radio came alive again. Lieutenant Commander Price picked up the microphone and delivered the emergency report, his voice steady despite the weight in his chest. "Command, this is HMAS Armidale. We have found 17 female bodies, frozen, on an unidentified fishing vessel. This is a critical situation. Requesting instructions and full support." The voice from command sounded grave. "Message received. Secure the vessel and detain all crew. An investigative team from the AFB and Queensland Police is mobilising. A special operation is being opened tonight. Operation Code 924N. Hearing those words, the sailors looked at each other. They knew a special operation code was only used for major cases, not just minor violations. It meant that from that moment, they were officially part of a major investigation that could shake the nation. Lieutenant Commander Price stared out at the dark sea surrounding them. In his heart, he prayed that tonight would be the beginning of the end for the criminal network that had been hiding in the seas. He also knew this journey would not be easy. They would be up against people who would sell human lives for profit. Amidst the activity, some sailors tried to compose themselves. Leading seaman Harrison, who hadn't been able to take his eyes off the bodies, took a long breath. He remembered the face of his daughter, who was the same age as the victims. His heart trembled, as if he was watching his own daughter's future being destroyed before his eyes. He whispered softly, "For your sakes, we will find justice." Meanwhile, the news began to spread rapidly. At headquarters, the emergency report was immediately forwarded to Queensland Police, then to AFP National Headquarters in Canberra. It didn't take long for phones to ring, for orders to be given. That night, in various police stations and naval bases, the lights stayed on. Even though it was late, all eyes were now focused on the boat bobbing in the Coral Sea. The mysterious boat was now officially primary evidence. The bodies inside it were not just victims, but silent witnesses to a major crime. The sailors knew from that moment on, every action they took had to be careful, because this case could become a dark chapter in the history of human trafficking in the country. On land, a few fishing families living on the coast started to wonder about the patrol boat's lights, which were unusual. Old Mick Yarra, the fisherman who was mending his nets earlier, was standing at the edge of the beach again. From a distance, he saw the patrol boat staying still, longer than usual, its lights beaming sharply at the sea. He wondered, what's going on out there? He had no idea that soon, the news coming from the sea would shock all of Australia. Back on the patrol boat, Lieutenant Commander Price gave his final order for the night. "We stay on high alert until the team from shore arrives. No one lets their guard down. The 3 suspects remain under watch. Remember, they might just be the tip of the iceberg." The sailors nodded. The night felt long. The sea breeze blew cold, cutting to the bone. But their spirits remained fiery. They knew this task was no longer just about guarding the sea. This was a humanitarian mission. And once Operation 924N was officially declared, the long journey to dismantle this criminal network had begun. That night, the Coral Sea witnessed the birth of a major operation that would shake the hearts of many. Carrying a story of grief, and at the same time, hope for justice. Dawn was just breaking over Cairns, as the 3 men arrested at sea were brought to the AFP building. The city streets were starting to get busy with market vendors hauling their catch to the markets. But behind the hustle and bustle, the atmosphere at the police headquarters was very different. The solid building was now the center of attention. The place where the mystery of the death ship would be unraveled. The 3 of them, Rick Santen, the skipper, Bruce Palmer, and Andy Shaw, were led into an interview room, still in handcuffs. Their faces were haggard, their eyes bloodshot from a sleepless night. They sat in a row on cold metal chairs. heads bowed, while the white fluorescent light overhead shone mercilessly on their pale faces. The interview room was simple. Just a wooden table, chairs, and a lamp directed right at their faces. On the other side sat the investigators, wearing plain clothes, their faces serious. The air in the room felt heavy, as if an invisible wall was pressing in on everyone inside. Detective Superintendent Ben Wyatt, the lead investigator assigned to the case, walked in with a steady gait. He was powerfully built, his gaze sharp. But his voice remained calm. He looked at the three men for a moment before speaking. "Do you know why you're here?" No answer. Rick just swallowed hard. Bruce fidgeted nervously, while Andy stared at the floor in silence. Wyatt continued. His firm voice filled the room. "Last night, 17 bodies of young women were found in the hold of your boat. Not one, not two, but 17. Don't even try to think we won't find out who's responsible." Rick finally spoke up. "We didn't know, sir. We were just told to carry a load, said it was frozen fish. We didn't know it was people." Bruce nodded quickly, backing him up. "That's right, sir. We are just ordinary fishermen. Someone paid us good money to carry a load. We just followed the skipper's orders." But their tone of voice sounded too rushed. Wyatt, who was experienced, knew that often, people who are lying give long, fast excuses. He leaned back in his chair and stared hard at them. "If you really didn't know, why were the ship's documents falsified, why was the registration number erased, and why did you panic when we wanted to open the hold?" Those questions hit hard. Rick fell silent, his face sweating. Bruce looked down even further. Andy bit his lip, as if holding something back. Wyatt continued in a colder tone. 17 lives is not a small thing. They weren't cargo. They were people. You think you can hide behind "I didn't know"? You can't lie to the law. The room fell silent again. The sound of the wall clock ticked loudly, marking the 10 seconds. Rick clenched his own hands tightly, trying to look calm, but his eyes were unsteady. Bruce started sweating heavily, drops forming on his temples. Meanwhile, Andy, the youngest, began to look unsteady. Another investigator entered, carrying a folder with photos from the crime scene, photos of the opened black bags, photos of the victims' pale faces, and photos of the ship's hold. The folder was placed on the table. Then, one by one, the photos were shown. "Look at this. This isn't fish. These are human beings. Their ages are almost the same as your own sisters. They still have families waiting for them at home. Can you bring yourselves to tell their families that you just didn't know?" Andy looked up briefly. His eyes were red, his lips trembling. He wanted to speak, but Rick shot him a sharp look, as if warning him to stay quiet. The pressure made Andy look down again. Wyatt stared hard at Rick. "You're the skipper. You're the oldest. You should have known the risks of every voyage. Don't waste our time with excuses." Rick took a deep breath and then answered in a hoarse voice. "I just needed the money, sir. Someone arranged the load, said it was important. We didn't dare refuse. We thought it was just seafood." But that answer was clearly not satisfying. Wyatt tapped the table slowly with his finger. "Money. It's always money. How long will people be willing to sell their conscience for a few notes?" Andy grew more agitated. His body was shaking, his hands sweating. He looked at the victims' photos on the table, then quickly looked away. Tears began to well up in his eyes. Wyatt watched his movements carefully. He knew the young man's defenses were starting to crack. It was only a matter of time until the truth came out. The interview room fell silent again. The three men still sat in silence, while the investigators kept watching, waiting for the right moment. The night at sea had revealed the frozen bodies. Now, the day in the interrogation room was peeling back the layers of lies. The truth was just waiting for its moment to explode. The atmosphere in the interview room was still tense. The white light shone on the three men's pale faces. The photos of the victims spread on the table made the air feel even heavier. Rick kept his head down. Bruce fidgeted restlessly. Andy kept biting his lip, as if there was something he wanted to say, but was held back by fear. Detective Superintendent Ben Wyatt stared hard at them. He knew not everyone could withstand prolonged pressure. Usually, the youngest, the most fragile, would be the first to break. So his gaze lingered longer on Andy. Andy didn't dare look back. His shoulders shook slightly. Cold sweat ran down his temples. He covered his face with both hands. Then, suddenly, a small sobbing sound was heard. Quiet at first, then louder. The room, which had been silent, was now filled with the cries of a young man who could no longer bear the burden. "I can't take it anymore, sir." His voice broke, choked with emotion. "I can't stand seeing all that. We were just ordered. This wasn't our plan." Rick turned quickly. His face was angry. His eyes flashed a warning for Andy to shut up. But Andy didn't care anymore. Tears flowed freely. The words just spilled out. "There's a woman, sir. She organized everything. People call her Shazza Marley." The room went silent. The name hung in the air, heavy with meaning. The investigators looked at each other and immediately started writing. Wyatt moved closer. His voice was calm but sharp. "Who is Shazza Marley?" Andy wiped his tears and looked at the victims' photos with eyes full of guilt. "She's the one who contacted us. Said there was a special cargo that had to be taken out of Australian waters. She prepared everything, from the cargo, the ice, even the drugs. We just followed orders and got paid." "How much were you paid?" asked Wyatt coldly. $30,000, sir. For one trip." Andy looked down. His voice was barely audible. Rick tried to interrupt, but Wyatt stared him down. "Quiet. It's not your turn to talk." Andy continued, his voice trembling. "I didn't know it was people. Marley handled everything. She gave us a phone number, but it was a burner, no ID. She's very careful, like she's used to this." Wyatt gestured to another investigator to note down the details. The phone number, the name, the methods. Every piece of information could be a key to opening a bigger door. Bruce finally spoke up too. His voice was faint. "It's true, sir. I saw her too when the boat docked at a small wharf near Port Douglas. She came with her people. We didn't dare ask too many questions. All we knew was to follow the skipper's orders." Bruce's words further strengthened Andy's testimony. Now, a clear thread was emerging. There was a mysterious woman known as Shazza Marley, who was the puppet master behind the scenes. Wyatt looked at them one by one, then said in a deep voice, "You must realize that 17 lives have been lost. If you keep staying silent, you share the blame for their deaths. But if you're honest, the law might still show you some leniency." Andy started crying again. "I'm scared, sir. This Marley, she's not just anyone. He said she has a lot of people behind her. If I talk, I could be in danger." Wyatt leaned in, looking straight into Andy's eyes. "You're here now. You're under our protection. The only way to save yourself is to talk." If you keep quiet, you'll only get in deeper. Andy's sobs slowly subsided. He took a long breath and looked back at the victims' photos on the table. In a hoarse voice, he said, "They were all so young, sir. They still had dreams. I don't want to be the one who stays silent while all this is happening." And at that point, an official confession was recorded. The name Shazza Marley, for the first time, entered the case file for Operation 924N. From the mouth of a young man who could no longer hide the truth, the door to the real mastermind was now open. Outside the interview room, the Cairns sun was climbing higher. People went about their daily business, unaware that inside that building, a new name had just surfaced. A name that would lead investigators into the dark network of human trafficking. For Wyatt and his team, Andy's tears weren't just an outburst of guilt, they were a turning point. Because from there, the long road of the investigation would begin, to uncover who Shazza Marley really was and how much power she held. That night, the AFB office in Cairns was never truly quiet. The lights in the investigation room were still on. Computer screens displayed rows of numbers and signal maps, while the sound of keyboards tapping was heard over and over. Operation 924N was officially underway, and all focus was now on the one name that had just been revealed from Andy Shaw's confession, Shazza Marley. On the investigator's desk, a battered old phone seized from the boat was being examined meticulously. The number that had contacted Andy was recorded there, but initial results showed it was just a prepaid burner SIM with no clear identity. In Australia, cards like that are hard to trace because they aren't registered. But for the technical team, no information is ever truly lost. Every call, every message, always leaves a trace on the cell towers. That night, the technicians were busy tracing the last known locations where the number was active. A young analyst named Rhiannon Stone pointed to a computer screen. "Sir, this number pops up frequently around Cairns, specifically in the marina area, and a few small cafes. But there was also a signal that briefly appeared near Morseman, and then disappeared again." Ben Wyatt stood behind her, taking in every detail. "So this person doesn't just hide in one place. She moves. That means she's used to avoiding surveillance." Rhi added, drawing a red line on the digital map. "The movement pattern of this number isn't random. Almost every weekend, it appears around the nightlife strip on the Cairns Esplanade, then disappears at the start of the week. As if there's a specific schedule." Wyatt nodded. "That means Marley has a regular circle. We need to send in a surveillance team." While the tech team worked, field investigators were also moving. For the past few days, news of the death ship had begun to circulate. Although just rumors among the marina workers, some fishermen whispered about a woman who often came in a fancy car, asking about young women who wanted to work overseas. The story was always the same. A promise of a big salary, easy work, and a bright future. Investigators immediately noted the testimony. Slowly, a picture of who Shazza Marley was began to form. She wasn't just a go-between, but someone skilled at persuasion, using sweet promises to ensnare victims. In the AFB briefing room, Wyatt updated the team. "We have a name, we have a phone number, and we have a movement pattern. But we don't have a face. Without a face, it's hard to convince a court. We need visual evidence." So, a plan was made. An undercover team would be deployed at the locations where the number's signal often appeared. The Cairns Marina, the nightclub district, and the main road towards Port Douglas. Some investigators posed as rideshare drivers. Others as small-time vendors, and some even pretended to be cafe workers. All with one goal, to catch a trace of Marley. The following days were a test of patience. The undercover officers had to blend in with the crowds, endure fatigue, and even pretend to chat with locals. But from that sacrifice, a small thread began to appear. A coffee van owner at the marina gave some valuable information. There's a woman, maybe in her 40s, often comes at night. Her hair's bleached blonde, likes to wear flashy clothes, and always gets into a white sedan. People call her Shazza. That information made the investigators' hearts pound. The puzzle pieces were fitting together. A few days later, a CCTV camera at a roadside cafe near Morsman managed to record a woman matching that description. She was seen entering with two men. Sat for a bit, then left again. Although her face wasn't completely clear, the way she dressed and the white car she drove matched the witness's description. Wyatt watched the footage over and over. This face. It's finally appeared. This is the person who's only been mentioned in whispers. This is Shazza Marley. But arresting her couldn't be done carelessly. Wyatt knew well that a woman like Marley must have a network protecting her. One wrong move, and she could disappear in an instant, like smoke in the wind. Therefore, the arrest operation had to be prepared meticulously. At his desk, Wyatt stared at the blurry CCTV screenshot. In his heart, he vowed that the 17 lives frozen on that death ship would get justice. Marley must not get away. And that night, behind the bustle of the tech team still tracing signals, behind the surveillance that continued, a new chapter of Operation 924N began. The faint trace had now turned into a real target. The name Shazza Marley was no longer just a whisper in an interrogation room. She was now a shadow being hunted in the real world. A woman hiding behind the bright lights of Cairns and far north Queensland. At the Royal Brisbane and Women's Hospital, RBWH, Forensic Pathology Unit, silence enveloped the forensic morgue. The smell of chemicals and disinfectant filled the air, mixed with the cold from the air conditioning. Behind the heavy steel doors, the 17 bodies found on the death ship now lay on steel tables. Their young faces looked stiff, as if still holding stories yet to be told. The forensic pathology team worked with meticulous care. The sound of rubber gloves snapped as they touched the frozen skin. Every wound, every mark was recorded in detail. Outside the room, investigators waited for the examination results with heavy hearts. They knew these bodies held important keys to unlocking the truth of the crime. Senior forensic pathologist, Dr. Sam Taylor, led the examination. With a serious face, he gave instructions to his team. Take tissue samples, record core temperature, check for ligature marks on the wrists. All procedures were followed according to standards, without missing the smallest detail. Hours passed. Each time a result came out, the clearer the picture of their cause of death became. Almost all victims had died from respiratory failure due to lack of oxygen in a confined space. There were also traces of injections in their arms, indicating they were given high doses of sedatives before they died. Dr. Taylor looked at the long notes in his hand. His voice was soft but firm when he explained to the investigators. They died 2 to 3 days before being found. Most due to a combination of sedatives and a confined, airless space. The wrists and ankles on many show marks from plastic ties. They had no chance to fight back. Ben Wyatt, who was present, clenched his fists. Every word from the doctor was like a stabbing knife. He imagined those young women, trapped in the darkness of the hold. Their bodies weakened by drugs, then slowly losing their breath. A death so silent, so torturous. But the forensic results didn't stop there. 2 of the 17 victims turned out to have incision scars on their lower abdomens. The wounds were not accidental, but crude surgical scars. As if their internal organs had been taken. This discovery made the room fall silent. Dr. Taylor looked at the investigators with eyes full of concern. There's a possibility they weren't just victims of human trafficking, but also organ trafficking. If that's true, then this network is far more cruel than we imagined. Those words made everyone's chest tighten. Wyatt closed his eyes for a moment. In his heart, he swore, a crime this enormous could not be left unpunished. Among the 17 victims, there was one who was finally identified more quickly. A young woman with a small tattoo of a red desert rose on her left shoulder. The tattoo was simple, but it was enough of a clue. After being photographed and sent to the police database, her identity was revealed. Her name was Daisy Ayers, 20 years old, from Mount Isa. She was reported missing a month ago. According to her family, Daisy had mentioned she was going to work in Canada, traveling via a non-traditional route. Since that day, her family had never heard from her again. The news cast a gloom over the investigation room. A name that was previously just a number now became a real person. A daughter with a family, dreams, and hopes. Wyatt stared at the photo of Daisy, still smiling on her driver's license. He felt a deep pain. He imagined a mother in Mount Isa waiting every day for news of her daughter. Hoping the phone would ring, hoping for good news. Now that hope was shattered, replaced by the bitterest news. A young investigator whispered softly. "How are we going to tell her family?" Wyatt turned and replied in a heavy voice. "There's no easy way, but it's better they know the truth than keep waiting in uncertainty." That afternoon, the identification of Daisy was sent to Mount Isa police. A team would be sent to visit her family. In the forensic unit, the atmosphere remained heavy. The other bodies were still awaiting identification. Every mark, every distinguishing feature was checked carefully. For Dr. Taylor, every body was a silent witness. They couldn't speak, but through their wounds and the marks on their skin, they told the story of the suffering they endured. And the forensic team's job was to translate that story so the world would know what happened. Night fell as the first day of examinations ended. Dr. Taylor closed his long notes and looked at Wyatt. One thing is clear, they did not die naturally. They died because they were treated like cargo. There was no mercy. Wyatt nodded, his eyes glistening. He knew their work had only just begun. A long road lay ahead, but the first step was clear. Find Shazamali and uncover everyone behind this network. Outside the forensic building, the lights of Brisbane began to switch on. Life went on. People laughed in cafes. Children played in the streets. Fishermen prepared their boats to go to sea. But inside that building, 17 lives served as a bitter reminder that behind the sparkle of life, there is a dark side that steals the future of the nation's youth. The night in Cairns seemed normal. The main streets were full of cars. Music from cafes and karaoke bars echoed among the buildings. But behind the noise, the Operation 924N investigation team was working in silence. They spread out to several points, blending in with the public, waiting for a trace of the woman who was now their main target, Shazamali. Initial information came from witnesses at the marina. Several fishermen admitted to often seeing a woman with a flashy appearance. Her hair was bleached blonde, her clothes always brightly colored. Often accompanied by a designer handbag that stood out to the locals. She didn't come alone. Sometimes she was with 2 or 3 burly men. The locals only knew one nickname for her, Shazza. That testimony grew stronger when the team managed to get CCTV footage from a small cafe near Morseman. In the footage, a woman with the same characteristics was clearly visible. She walked in confidently, sat for a moment, then left, carrying a large bag. Outside, a white sedan was waiting for her. Although the footage was a bit blurry, It was enough to confirm that this woman was indeed the same person described by the witnesses. Ben Wyatt stared at the monitor screen over and over. This is the face that's only been mentioned in whispers. Finally, Marley isn't just a name, she's a real person. But finding out who she really was wasn't easy. The investigators had to dig deeper. So, several undercover team members were deployed. They posed as rideshare drivers, street food vendors, and even cafe waiters. They spent their days observing the movements around the nightclub district. It didn't take long for Marley's habits to become clear. She often appeared at night, especially on weekends. The white car she used was often parked near cheap karaoke bars or small motels. From there, she would usually talk to young women who looked naive. Most had come from interstate looking for work. An investigator posing as a rideshare driver, Dan, reported his experience. That night, he had deliberately waited in front of a small karaoke bar. Sure enough, Marley arrived in her flashy clothes. She spoke to two young women. From a distance, Dan heard the sentences coming from her mouth. She said the work was easy, the pay was great, and they could quickly send money home. The young women looked tempted. Their faces lit up as if they saw new hope. That report made Wyatt even more certain. The pattern was classic but deadly. Sweet promises about easy jobs with high pay were always a trap that was hard to resist for those coming from humble backgrounds. Besides field information, investigators also began to dig into Marley's past. Police archives revealed that the woman, fully named Sharon Shazza Marley, had previously served time for prostitution and trafficking charges in Perth almost 10 years ago. After getting out, she moved from city to city, never staying long in one place. Marley was known to be slippery, hard to catch, and good at manipulating people. Her lavish lifestyle was also an important clue. Despite having no official job, she always appeared glamorous, expensive clothes, designer bags, even the latest phone. All of this certainly didn't match her economic background. The police suspected her lifestyle was funded by a larger criminal network. One night, the surveillance team managed to get a clear photo of Marley as she left a small motel in Cairns. In the photo, she was wearing a striking red dress. Her blonde hair was down, her lips coated in thick lipstick. Beside her, a burly man carried a black suitcase. The photo became the first strong visual evidence of her presence. Wyatt stared at the photo for a long time. Marley's face radiated confidence, as if she were immune to the law. But behind her slight smile, Wyatt could sense a trace of ruthlessness. This woman wasn't just a recruiter. She was a key node in a network that treated human beings like mere goods. Now the puzzle was becoming clearer. Marley was no longer a vague shadow. She was real, living in the Cairns and Mosman area, spreading false promises to lure young women. Her lavish lifestyle was her shield, while her fear of the law made her keep moving. Wyatt knew the next step was to wait for the right time. Marley had to be arrested in a way that left no room for escape. One small mistake could make her disappear like a bird flying into the night sky. So, meeting after meeting was held, and an arrest plan was slowly formulated. Meanwhile, the surveillance team kept working, following her every move, recording every meeting, all to ensure that this time, Marley would not get away. And that night, in his quiet office, Wyatt closed the folder containing Marley's photos. In his heart, he whispered, "The 17 lives frozen in that ship's hold now have a voice. That voice will lead us until their mastermind is caught." That afternoon, the sky over Cairns began to grow dim. The sun slowly set behind the mountains that separated the city from the open sea. The streets were filled with vehicles. Shop lights turned on one by one. The sounds of street vendors called out. In the midst of the crowd, the Operation 924N team was on full alert. The latest report confirmed that tonight would be the decisive night. Information from the undercover team indicated that Shazamali would meet with two young women at a small cafe in the city centre. The women were from a remote community in the Northern Territory. They had just arrived in Cairns with hopes of getting a job. Marley had promised a meeting to discuss work as waitresses overseas with a large salary. The cafe was simple. Wooden tables were lined up under yellow lights. From the outside, it didn't look special. But almost every seat was already occupied by an undercover officer. Some posed as rideshare drivers, some sat like tourists, and one even sold snacks at the front door. Everything was set up perfectly. In a car not far from there, Ben Wyatt monitored via radio. He reminded all members that the target must be captured alive, and the two young women Marley was luring must be secured first. The clock struck 8 p.m. A white sedan stopped in front of the cafe. A woman in a bright green dress got out. Her hair was bleached blonde, her lips bright red, and she clutched a designer bag. It was Shazamali. The two young women, who were already waiting, stood up to greet her. Their faces were nervous but full of hope. Marley patted one of them on the shoulder and began to speak in a convincing tone. She said that in Canada, there was easy work with a big salary, just serving guests in a restaurant. She added that after a few months of work, they could send a lot of money home to their families. The young women seemed to believe her. They nodded, occasionally smiling as they imagined their bright future. Marley then pulled out a wad of cash and placed it on the table as a sign of seriousness. She said they had to go with her tonight so they could leave tomorrow. Wyatt, listening over the radio, gave a short command. Move in. In a matter of seconds, the situation changed. The officer sitting near the door moved quickly to block the exit. Two others moved in from the right and left. Marley was shocked. Her eyes widened. She tried to get up, but her hands were immediately grabbed by a female officer, and handcuffs were snapped onto her wrists. Marley screamed at the top of her lungs, demanding an explanation, saying she had many connections and the police would regret this. But her voice didn't faze the team. Meanwhile, the two young women sitting at the table froze in fear. A female officer approached them, calming them down, telling them they were safe and had just been rescued from great danger. Marley continued to struggle. Her gaze was sharp. Her face was red with anger, but the handcuffs on her wrists were too strong. It all happened so fast that she didn't have a chance to find a way to escape. Wyatt entered the cafe. After everything was secure, he stood tall in front of Marley and informed her in a firm voice that she was under arrest on suspicion of human trafficking. He also stated that 17 lives had been lost because of her actions. Marley snorted, then said she was just a middleman and the police had the wrong person. Her smile was thin, trying to cover her nervousness. Wyatt wasn't baited. For him, this arrest wasn't the end, but the beginning. With Marley captured, the path to the larger network was now open. The officers then led Marley out of the cafe to a special vehicle. The two young women were taken to another vehicle for protection. Their faces were still in shock. But slowly, they began to understand that their lives had just been saved. The Cairns night wind blew strongly, carrying the salty smell of the sea into the city. The streets remained as busy as usual. People passed by, unaware that a significant event had just taken place in a small cafe. For the Operation 924N team, that night marked a new chapter. From the death ship full of frozen bodies, they had now managed to capture the woman who had been recruiting victims with false promises. That night, the interview room at the AFP office in Cairns felt colder than usual. The fluorescent light overhead illuminated the long wooden table, which was covered with files, photos, and notes from the operation. At the end of the table, Shazza Marley sat with her hands cuffed. Her face was still adorned with the remnants of heavy makeup, her red lips now looked dry, but a cynical smile appeared occasionally, as if she didn't care. Across from her, Detective Superintendent Ben Wyatt sat calmly. His gaze was sharp, his body leaned slightly forward, applying psychological pressure. Two other investigators stood at the side of the room, ready to write down every word she said. Wyatt opened the conversation in a flat voice. He stated that Marley was arrested on strong suspicion of her involvement in human trafficking. He mentioned the 17 female bodies found frozen on the fishing boat. He also mentioned the statements from Andy and Bruce that implicated her. Marley straightened up and said with an arrogant tone that she was just a middleman. She accused the police of getting the wrong person. She claimed her job was just to help young women find work overseas. Nothing more. Wyatt smiled faintly. He pushed a large folder towards Marley. The folder contained photos from the cafe where she was arrested, CCTV footage of her talking to victims, and transcripts of conversations recorded by the undercover team. Wyatt stressed that all the evidence showed Marley wasn't just a middleman, but a primary recruiter. Marley was silent for a moment. Her eyes darted, reading the photos. But she lifted her chin again, trying to stay strong. She said the women came of their own free will. She just offered a way, never forced them. Wyatt tapped the table with his finger, slowly but with pressure. He said that the 17 victims frozen in the ship's hold had also been promised the same thing. They were all lured with the promise of easy work, big pay, and a bright future. He asked, "Does Marley dare to look at the photos of those cold faces and still say she's not guilty?" Those words made the room silent. Marley looked down for a moment, then let out a small, bitter laugh. She said the world is tough. Everyone is looking for a way to survive. She added that she was just going with the flow, doing what she could for money. Wyatt watched her in silence. He knew Marley's defenses were starting to crack. He then brought up the amount of money Marley received for each shipment. He mentioned the $30,000 figure, according to Andy's statement. He asked if Marley would dare to swear she never received that money. Marley's smile slowly faded. She fidgeted in her chair. Then she finally admitted that she did receive money. But she again tried to defend herself, claiming she was just following orders from someone high up. She called herself just a small cog in a big machine. Wyatt leaned in. His voice was lower but piercing. He asserted that every life lost was her responsibility. It didn't matter if Marley was the boss or just a cog, the victim's blood was still on her hands. Marley bit her lip and then took a long breath. She said quietly that she had indeed taken young women to the wharf. She admitted her job was to lure them with promises of work and then hand them over to the group that arranged the sea voyage. The room was silent for a moment. The investigators wrote down every word. This admission was a big step. Even if she wasn't being completely honest. Wyatt then asked who gave her the orders. Marley shook her head, trying to stall. She said she didn't know the real name, only a title they used. Wyatt looked at her for a long time, then placed the photo of the victim, Daisy Ayers, on the table. He said, his voice trembling, that this girl was only 20 years old. She left with the hope of sending money to her mother in Mount Isa. But now, she was just a frozen body. He asked if Marley could look at that photo and still think her job was something normal. Marley's expression changed. Her smile was completely gone. She turned her face away and said in a hoarse voice that she never intended to kill anyone. She was just doing her job. Nothing more. Wyatt replied coldly that it was precisely because she stayed silent and did her job without a conscience that 17 lives were lost. He stressed that the law would demand accountability, and Marley could no longer hide. Marley was silent for a long time, then finally said that she was willing to talk further, but asked for a guarantee of safety. She was afraid because the person above her was very powerful and dangerous. Wyatt signaled to the team to note that sentence in detail. For him, this was a new door opening. That night, the interrogation wasn't over. But one thing was clear. Marley was finally starting to admit she was part of a large network, and there was someone above her who was more powerful. Outside the interview room, the Cairns night grew late. Only the sound of insects and the occasional roar of a vehicle could be heard. But inside that building, Operation 924N had just entered a darker chapter. From Marley's confession, the investigators knew they were dealing with something far bigger than they had originally thought. The atmosphere in the interview room was still thick with tension. The wall clock ticked slowly, marking every second that dragged on. Shazza Marley sat with her head bowed. The handcuffs on her wrists glinted in the light. For the last few minutes, she hadn't said much, just took long, deep breaths as if at war with herself. Detective Superintendent Ben Wyatt waited patiently. He knew that to break down the defenses of someone like Marley, it took patience and the right amount of pressure. He didn't interrupt, just let the silence apply psychological pressure. Finally, Marley lifted her face. The makeup on her cheeks had begun to streak, leaving tired lines. In a hoarse voice, she said that she was indeed part of a large network. She admitted she wasn't the mastermind, just a hand carrying out orders. Wyatt nodded slowly and asked her to name who gave the orders. Marley hesitated. Her eyes darted left and right, as if someone was watching from behind the wall. Then, in a voice that was almost a whisper, she said one name, Chen Yong. The room instantly fell silent. The name felt foreign to some of the younger investigators, but Wyatt, with his experience, immediately recognized the pattern. Transnational human trafficking rings are often led by a foreign figure, who is slippery and hides outside the local legal jurisdiction. Wyatt stared at Marley intently, asking for confirmation. Marley nodded slowly. She said that Chen Yong was a man from Guangxi, China. He was the one who arranged everything. Marley's job was just to find young women from remote towns, lure them with false promises, and then send them to the boat crews that were waiting. All decisions were in Chen Yong's hands. Another investigator immediately noted the details. Marley continued, saying she had been working for this network for over 3 years. Every time there was a shipment, she received instructions by phone. The number always changed, but she knew very well the voice giving the orders was the same. Chen Yong never appeared in person, but always made sure the money was transferred on time through intermediary accounts. Wyatt asked, did Marley know what happened to the women after they left? Marley took a long breath and looked down. She said that some were indeed promised jobs in restaurants or entertainment venues overseas, but many never reached their destination. Some disappeared, some were forced to work in casinos, and some were even rumored to be sold for their organs. Those words made the room fall silent again. The investigators felt their skin crawl. This crime was far more vicious than they had imagined. Wyatt pressed the question again. Did Marley ever see proof of organ trafficking herself? Marley shook her head. But she admitted she was once told by one of Chen Yong's subordinates that a victim's body still had value. They were called cold cargo, still sellable even after they were dead. The investigators' faces hardened upon hearing that. Wyatt clenched his fists under the table, holding back his anger. He knew this confession would be a crucial basis for involving international cooperation. Marley then elaborated. Chen Yong was known to be cunning, always moving, often using false identities. Among his subordinates, he was called Mr. Chen. A man of few words, but his every word was a command. He controlled the sea routes between Queensland, the Philippines, and the waters off Guangxi. Every time there was a shipment, Marley received detailed instructions on where to gather the women, when to leave, and to which boat they should be handed over. Chen Yong had people in various small ports, making his route difficult to track. Wyatt listened intently. He realized that Operation 924N was no longer just a local case. It had now crossed into the international domain. He knew the next step must involve Interpol and the Chinese authorities. Marley finally stopped talking. Tears streamed slowly. She said she was scared too. She knew this network was huge and people who crossed it could just disappear. But after seeing the victims' photos, her heart couldn't hold it all in anymore. Wyatt looked at her in silence. He knew Marley wasn't being completely honest. There were probably still things she was hiding. But the confession about Chen Yong was a huge door that had opened. Now, the real mastermind was coming into view. An emergency meeting was held immediately that night. Wyatt reported the developments to his superiors in Canberra. Chen Yong's name was added to the wanted list. The data collected would be immediately sent to the Chinese authorities through diplomatic channels. The night grew later. Outside the AFP building, the city lights flickered calmly. As if the world didn't know a massive secret had just been uncovered inside that building. The investigators sat seriously in the briefing room. Their faces were hard, full of determination. They knew the road ahead was still long. But one thing was certain, the dark shadow named Chen Yong was now the primary target. The sky over Canberra was still dark when the official report for Operation 924N landed on a desk at AFP National Headquarters. Chen Yong's name was clearly listed as the mastermind behind the human trafficking operation that claimed 17 lives in the seas off Queensland. The document was immediately forwarded to the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, and then through diplomatic channels to China. In a matter of hours, the case transformed from a national investigation into a transnational operation. In Beijing, the Interpol Regional Office for Asia-Pacific received the same news. The report shocked many officials. Chen Yong was not an unknown name, but until now, he had only been mentioned in intelligence documents without solid proof. Now, with Marley's confession and the physical evidence from the death ship, his position as a major kingpin was undeniable. That afternoon at AFP headquarters in Canberra, a joint meeting was held. Representatives from DFAT, the Royal Australian Navy, and ASIO were present. Ben Wyatt was called in to present his findings directly from the field. With a steady voice, he explained how Marley recruited victims, how the boat carried the bodies, and how Chen Yong's name was finally revealed. The atmosphere in the meeting was serious. Every head nodded slowly. Finally, it was decided that Australia would propose official cooperation with the Chinese police. The goal was clear: to hunt down and arrest Chen Yong, whatever the risks. The following days were busy. Evidence documents were photocopied, victim photo files were prepared, and forensic reports were attached. All were sent to the Chinese authorities through diplomatic channels. Before long, a response came. The Chinese police force stated their readiness to cooperate. They also acknowledged that Chen Yong had been on their watch list for a long time, but he was slippery and always changing locations. The latest intelligence indicated Chen Yong was operating out of a small industrial park in Guangxi. The place was camouflaged as a seafood processing plant, but it was actually a transit point for victims before they were sold. From there, the transnational human trafficking route was managed. Wyatt received the news directly from an online meeting with Chinese police officials. They planned to conduct a joint operation, with Australia sending a small team as liaisons and case witnesses. Wyatt was appointed to lead the Australian team. When the plane landed in Nanning, Guangxi, Wyatt felt the foreign, dry air, which was thick with tension. With him were two senior investigators and an interpreter. They were met by Chinese police officers whose faces were hard and alert. At the local police headquarters, a large map of the Guangxi region was displayed. A red dot marked the location of the seafood processing plant suspected of being Chen Yong's base. There, according to intelligence, was an underground warehouse where victims were hidden. The operation plan was meticulous. The joint Chinese task force would be the tip of the spear. The Australian team's role was to observe, provide additional information, and identify evidence related to the victims from Australia. The night before the operation, Wyatt sat in his simple hotel room. He looked at the photos of the victims he had brought from Brisbane. Their young faces seemed to look back at him, demanding justice. Wyatt promised himself that this time, the mastermind would not get away. In the early morning, the operation began. Hundreds of Chinese police spread out around the industrial park. They were dressed in black, complete with bulletproof vests. The Australian team joined them, undercover in a logistics vehicle. The cold air mixed with dust made it hard to breathe. But everyone's spirit was high. When the signal was given, the forces moved in unison. The factory gates were breached. Shouts echoed as the armed tactical unit moved in quickly. Several guards tried to resist but were quickly neutralized. Wyatt went inside with them. Behind the factory floor, which was filled with a fishy smell, they found a corridor leading to an underground warehouse. From inside, they could hear knocking, crying, and faint screams. The steel door was forced open, revealing dozens of pale-faced people. Most were young women, huddled together in a cramped space. The sight made Wyatt's chest tighten. He immediately helped the victims out. Meanwhile, the Chinese medical team moved quickly to provide aid. Many of the victims were from Southeast Asia, and several, it turned out, were Australians who had been missing for months. In another room, the team managed to arrest a large man with a hard face. It was Chen Yong. He had tried to escape through a back door, but his path was blocked by the surrounding forces. Handcuffs were immediately locked on his wrists. Wyatt stood not far away, looking directly at the man's face. In his heart, he said that the 17 lives frozen in the Coral Sea had now been avenged. The mastermind had finally fallen into the hands of the law. The operation ended around noon. Dozens of people were arrested, and hundreds of pieces of evidence were secured. From travel documents, cash, to the sedatives used to incapacitate the victims. The underground warehouse was now a silent witness to the crimes that had been hidden for so long. That afternoon, a joint press conference was held. The Chinese police announced they had successfully dismantled a major international human trafficking network with the help of information from Australia. Chen Yong's name was mentioned as the leader, and he was now officially the primary suspect. Wyatt stood behind the podium, not saying much. He just looked at the cameras and remembered the faces of the victims he had seen in the Brisbane morgue. He felt a sense of relief. Although he knew the fight was still long, at least one major step had been achieved. That night in his simple hotel room, Wyatt wrote his official report. He wrote that justice for the 17 lives was now beginning to be served. However, he also added that there were still many other victims who needed to be saved. The journey was not over. In the briefing room at the AFP office in Cairns, the investigators sat in a circle, their faces serious. Spread on the table were photos, maps of sea routes, and notes from the interrogations. After the arrests of Marley in Cairns and Chen Yong in Guangxi, it was now time to reconstruct the victim's journey. The main goal was to explain clearly how 17 young women were ensnared from the beginning to their tragic end. Ben Wyatt stood in front of a large whiteboard. He drew a long line from the Northern Territory and Western Sydney to Queensland. The line then branched out towards the sea route that ended in international waters. Pointing to the map, he explained step by step. Step 1 is recruitment. Shazamali and her network travelled to remote communities, to markets, even to worker accommodations. They approached young women with promises of work overseas. Marley always spoke sweetly, mentioning big salaries, easy work, and the chance to help their families. Many of them were eventually tempted, especially given their difficult economic backgrounds. Step 2 is the temporary holding house. After successfully luring them, Marley brought the victims to a small rental house on the outskirts of Cairns. From the outside, it looked like an ordinary house, but inside, the victims were held for several days. They were forbidden from contacting their families, forbidden from going out, and given the excuse that all their travel documents were being processed. Step 3 is the transfer to the boat. This was usually done at night to avoid attention. The victims were forced to drink a liquid mixed with sedatives. They felt weak, easy to manage, and were then led onto the fishing boat. The steel hold door was shut tight. The young bodies were left lying in the cramped space with dozens of others. Step 4 is the death voyage. Inside the hold, the air was stuffy, oxygen was thin. The victims who were still conscious cried, begged, and tried to bang on the walls of the boat. But no one heard, or rather, no one cared. When they resisted, the crew members increased the dose of sedatives via injection. In a semi-conscious state, their bodies grew stiff. Their breaths became shorter. Wyatt paused for a moment, his eyes glistening. He looked at the photo of one of the victims, Daisy Ayers from Mount Isa, who was found with the desert rose tattoo on her shoulder. He said that every victim had a story, a family, and a dream. But in that dark hold, all their hopes came to an end. Step 5 is death. In the cramped space without fresh air, the young bodies slowly lost their lives. One by one, they collapsed. Most due to lack of oxygen, some due to an overdose of drugs. Within 2 or 3 days, the hold turned into a death chamber. Step 6 is preservation. The bodies that were now lifeless were not just left. They were put into black plastic bags and then stacked under ice. For this network, even a corpse was still considered merchandise that could be sold. The investigators listened to the explanation with grim faces. Their hearts ached, imagining the final moments of the victims. Leading seaman Harrison, who was present in the room, clutched his own photo tightly. He thought of his daughter at home, who was the same age as the victims. He whispered softly, "May their souls find a more peaceful place." This reconstruction was not just a legal record, but also a bitter reminder of how cruel human trafficking is. Wyatt emphasized that this network didn't just trade in living bodies, but also viewed human beings as cold commodities that could be treated like goods at a market. That night, after the meeting ended, Wyatt walked out of the building and looked up at the star-filled Cairns sky. In the distance, the sound of the sea could be heard. The waves repeatedly hit the shore.